Kathryn is the Mosbacher Director at the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, as well as a Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. She is also a courtesy professor at like a whole host of Stanford institutions, including the Political Science Department and the Hoover Institution. Before moving to Stanford, she was on faculty at Princeton and Columbia and McGill. She's also held fellowships at Harvard and the Woodrow Wilson Center in DC. She earned her Ph.D. From Harvard and her BA and MA from the University of Toronto, which is where I lived when I was little. We are happy to award Professor Stoner the U.S. Russia Relations Book Prize winner for her third sole authored book. Am I right about that, Kathryn?
I think that's right.
Yes, third sole authored book, sixth book overall. For Russia Resurrected, its power and purpose in a new global order. So the way this will work is, first I'm going to give the prize to Kathryn, then she will give her talk. Then the two of us will sit at those super comfy chairs and chat a little bit and hopefully take questions from you for the rest of the time. So Professor Stoner, come on up and take your prize. You want to close?
Oh,
yeah.
I heard I was allowed to take my mask.
You are allowed to take your mask off,
okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Is that all right? Everyone comfortable? I'm back.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan.
Kathryn, the floor is yours. I'm going to
all right.
this way.
Thank you, Dan and Chris and Arik. I'm going to put this down in a treasured spot here. And I'm going to move around this way. And thank you so much. This is an amazing honor to get this prize. And I think actually the last recipient was my neighbor, Norman Neymark. Is that right? At also Stanford in the history department. Our dogs even play together. So when I told him I was coming here, he said, that's awesome. We meet frequently in the dog park. But so that's excellent company I know to be in. So I'm very honored. So this is a book I had worked on for 5 or 6 years, actually, before everything that has happened. So it was in reaction to a comment that was made by a member of our intelligence community when he came to speak at Stanford, who said that Russia belongs to the little table with North Korea in international affairs. That it wants to be at the adult table with us, but really it's at the little table. And I thought that's a really serious misunderstanding of Russia's capabilities. And it's a narrow understanding. And I had already started some work on the book, but part of what I tried to do is rethink power and how we measure power as influence. And so if you just measure it as a realist might, as men, military, and money, then you're right. You could add up the size of Russia's economy, the size of its military, that is how many mostly men serve, and the population. And if you tally that up, Russia doesn't look like the United States and it doesn't look like China. And yet it still has a lot of influence in the world. So why is that? And what are its tools of influence? And I'm hoping that we get relatively quickly into also, has Russia now been ruined? Is the resurrection over? Or also was the purpose of the resurrection to do, and this seems odd around Easter, Passover to be talking about the resurrection, but anyway, or maybe it's appropriate. Maybe that was the plan, Chris, in the first place. But whether Putin has now ruined Russia with this invasion of Ukraine. Okay, so I'm going to try and move the slides forward, but for some reason we're having trouble with that. So let me see if I can do it this way. I'd have to do it manually. Did that work? Okay. Yes. Okay, good. So here's our, I almost wanted to say hero, but I really meant arch-villain. The book is not really about him so much, although I do start each chapter with some amusing quotes from Mr. Putin. And here he is in 2002, paraphrasing Talleyrand and Churchill and a bunch of other people who said something like, Russia was never so strong as it wants to be and never so weak as it is thought to be. Here he is boasting about Russia being back in 2008 and saying that alas, Russia has returned to the world as a strong state, a country that others heed and can stand up for itself. He's celebrating the awarding of the Sochi Olympics to Russia at that time. Remember the Sochi Olympics in 2014? And then here he is boldly saying in 2018, in just years, we have undergone changes that have taken centuries in other countries. So Russia is great. Russia is back. Russia is a developmental miracle. Russia is a global power. So this is also, I think, in partial reaction to some of the nasty things, in particular, that Barack Obama said about Russian power. In 2014, the first time Russia invaded Ukraine, or the first time recently Russia, well, not the most recent, but the time before that, in 2014, invaded Ukraine, of course, seizing Crimea. Barack Obama says it's a regional power threatening its neighbors out of weakness, not out of strength. This annoyed Mr. Putin, we know. Here's Mitt Romney paraphrasing John McCain, who called it infamously a gas station masquerading as a country. Mitt Romney, when he was running for the nomination of the Republican Party, saying it's a gas station with nukes, versus these folks. Phil Breedlove, who the Russians referred to, he told me it's breed hate when he was Supreme Commander of NATO in 2015, saying it's rewriting the Cold War settlement using force. Wow, prescient. Russia is an existential threat to the United States. So you can just see how torn the policy community was about how to, in the last 10 years, how to think about Russia and the threat that it presented in particular to the United States. And then President Biden kind of cluing in October of 2020, saying, I think the biggest threat, this is when he's debating Donald Trump. And I think he shortly thereafter said, would you shut up, man, or something like that, remember? I think the biggest threat to America right now in terms of breaking up our security and our alliances is Russia. Secondly, our biggest competitor is China. So thinking of them in two very different ways, and I think hinting at different dimensions of state power. So 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is Russia strong or weak? And are we any further informed on that question by what Russia is doing today? And what does strength or weakness mean? What is power really? So I know there are a lot of Russia specialists in the room. For those that are not Russia specialists, just here are some quick facts. Depending on who you count or what you count as part of Russia, if you don't count Crimea, population is about 144.5 million, although there is an estimate since this official number came out that in COVID, Russia has about 1 million excess deaths. The official numbers are about 350,000 excess deaths, but it seems like it's closer to 1 million. If you don't count Crimea, the population is about 144.5 million. And of course, most people don't count Crimea. It's not a good demographic strategy taking over other countries, I think. GDP per capita in the last normal year, that is before COVID, really strikes, was just under $30,000. And the important thing, that's a purchasing power parity. The important thing is it's about 3 times what it was at the time of collapse in 1991. So a real change in people's living standards, in expectations. Russians had never lived better, never been wealthier, and despite COVID deaths, never healthier than they were then in 2019. And you can see it's about half of what U.S. GDP per capita is at purchasing power parity. So when you think about the Russian economy, don't obviously believe Rachel Maddow and people like that saying it's a mess, it's a mess, it's a shambles, it's a mess. And I think we had that perception for too long without actually looking at the data and underestimated it, but it wasn't a mess. It's going to be a mess again, but it was certainly a mess in the 90s. By 2019, and actually even until February, it was not a mess. We'll go more deeply into some of those numbers, and then later perhaps we can talk about the possible resilience of the Russian economy, given all the sanctions that we have put on and more that we might. Yes, the Russian economy is primarily commodity driven, but it's not just oil and natural gas. It is largely that, and certainly that's very important to the Russian budget. In 2019, oil and gas was about 30% of the government's budget. It has bumped up as high to almost 40%, but it's not 100%. This is not Saudi Arabia. It sells other things. Some of those are commodities, those other things, nickel, for example, some precious metals. And it is the world's #1 wheat exporter, at least until the war. And that's actually important and significant because you might remember that in the 1990s, there was worry about famine in Russia in the immediate wake of the Soviet collapse. And it has not actually been the world's largest exporter of wheat since before the revolution in 1917. So this was actually for them quite a huge achievement. And it's having a negative effect, that is the war right now and the sanctions on Russian exports on the food supply in the Middle East and Africa in particular. We might see more and more of that as time goes on. It is becoming, or had been becoming, less dependent on oil in particular. And its resource rents from oil were declining. They bump up and down as the attempts at diversification, which have not been completely successful, have been pursued. Okay, so just in quick comparison, and again, to sort of drill down on this issue of power, if you compare Russia to the US and China, and I tossed in the United Kingdom here, so we got another power in the world, but not necessarily the size of these two, the US and China. Well, the GDP in 2019 in trillions of dollars, 2019 dollars, is pretty small compared to the US and China, of course, and small even compared to the United Kingdom. It's about, and I will confess right now that Dan mentioned I did my undergrad at University of Toronto, and I had forgotten I got a master's there too. Thanks for the reminder there, the heads up, that it's about the size of the Canadian economy. So Canadian economy is decent, obviously fewer people living in Canada than Russia, so GDP per capita is not as big in Russia as it is, I don't know why that's appearing, as big in Russia as it is in Canada. But, you know, it has become an upper middle income country. It's not the biggest economy in the world, and it's certainly not the smallest. It's people living better than they ever had. So think Greece, basically, but without all the debt. That's Russia. Military spending is a little, and I'll try and mess you up on this, a little bit misleading the way it's presented here. In terms of US dollars in 2018, and this is C3 data, which is in the book, nicely presented there, is about 1/10 of US military spending. But if you consider that Russians actually pay in rubles and they make their own equipment, they get a little more bang from their buck. So if you do this at purchasing power parity, as I do in the book, it actually, the spending's high, especially high per capita. Not as high as the US, of course, but brings it closer to China. And it's about, it looks the way we present it here, not purchasing power parity, about the same as British spending on the military, but they get a lot more bang for their buck, to be sure. Okay. Let me just, what happened? What happened? I have two screens going here and they seem to be messing. Hang on one sec. All right. So the big question here, we're watching Russia obviously in a war in its regional sphere of influence, Mr. Putin would call it. Has Russia actually returned as a global power, or is it just the regional power that Barack Obama called it? And one of the arguments in the book is it's not the same kind of global influencer as is the United States, for example, or even China, but it has now reestablished a global footprint. And so I don't know what's going on. This is all, there's a ghost in this computer here. I think it has to do with, right, me doing Zoom.
The internet connection's dropping.
Okay, did we just drop everyone? Did we just drop everyone, or are we all?
No, we're here.
We're still Zooming?
Yep.
Huh, wonder why.
think the room is still able to tune in, so you can.
I can keep going. Okay. All right. Well, I did that anyway, so let's see what happens. Okay. So I'm going to assume you can hear and see me and everything's good. I'm here.
We in the room.
You can. You are here. Okay. I'm not going to worry about
They
it.
can still see you, it's just the slides.
Although I was dying to tell you you're on mute. Yeah, to the room.
Oh, very funny. Am I? Yeah. Very good. Good. Okay. So here we are in looking at some of the things that have happened in the last 10 years in particular in terms of Russian global influence. And we start with the 2014 seizure of Crimea, of course, support of a low-boil war in the Donbass region, that Russia appears to be amassing forces at the moment to take in a grand manner, claiming actually that it was merely helping some separatists and saving the Russian speakers in the Donbass. I have a Ukrainian friend who says the last thing Ukrainians want to hear is that I'm a Russian and I'm here to save you. They don't want to be saved necessarily, but saying that Russian soldiers, if they were there fighting, then they were just on vacation and they happened to bring their tanks with them, but they denied that support. The mobilization into Syria in 2015, quick, somewhat unexpected on our side, and pretty much changing the facts on the ground. When a settlement comes, if a settlement has arrived in Syria, certainly we will not be part of it. Russia working with Iran will be. The election interference alleged in 2016, I have to say alleged, but I think we have pretty good data that Russia did attempt to interfere there. Brexit interference, financing Marine Le Pen. I think people are looking now to see whether or not the Russian government is helping to finance Marine Le Pen now in the French election. Buzzing U.S. warships with fighter planes, that has continued. And the promotion of populism in 2018 and 2019, largely using money in a way that the Soviet Union actually never did. Solar winds, someone mentioned hacking into the computer here, perhaps. 2021, also hacking into Microsoft accounts. Here we are, and I'm skipping a lot of other things that have happened, of course, in 2022, now with a war in the heart of Europe, in Ukraine. Okay, let me see. Yay. So, a lot of people had claimed that Russia was actually punching above its weight here. When we, think about Russian power, well, people used to, and it wasn't just Donald Trump, think of Putin as some kind of strategic genius who was capable of using what Russia had very adeptly and adroitly. But I think that what I try to do in the book is provide two correctives to how we think about power, and not just think about it in terms of men, military, and money, but look at other capabilities that states have. Think of power as multidimensional and contextual, right? So when you are playing cards, when you're playing bridge, a good hand of cards and bridge is different than a good hand of cards in poker, right? Sometimes the ace is good, sometimes an ace is not good. And the other thing is that what a country has at its disposal, power tools, can be good enough to be very disruptive in international relations. And I think we saw that, for example, in the elections in 2016, but there are lots of other examples as well. I think the characterization, this is what the book argues, the characterization of Russia as weak is outdated, even with what is going on with its military, which we can talk about. That Russia has recovered some of the tools of international power that the Soviet Union had, and some of those prior capacities more than we've anticipated, and that some new tools also are being employed. It's very adept, as we know, in terms of cyber power, than we have appreciated. And that this is linked specifically to the domestic politics of Russia and the domestic political system that has developed over the last 10 to 15 years in particular. And that President Putin uses Russia's tools of power differently than another regime might do. So in this way, that the study tries to link domestic and international politics, asking the question whether or not a different kind of regime would behave the same way. So this is just, again, going into sort of dimensions just to prove to you I thought about power a little bit. It turns out, I should confess that I'm largely a comparative political scientist as opposed to being a student of international relations and international relations theory. And so no offense here, Dan, but you guys have not made a lot of progress since I was in graduate school down the street here on power. And so I present it in 3 dimensions here, looking at the means, which is men, military, and money. But then I also go and look at geographic domain, where and how many countries does a country exercise power on whom, and then whether or not it's an important actor in these areas. And so if we think of this, then think about North Korea, right? Doesn't affect that many countries, South Korea, Japan. And then Russia has a huge, as we'll see, demographic domain. It has 14 international borders. The only other country in the world that has that many is China. And in a few policy areas, it's an like energy, it's an incredibly weighty actor. And if you filled up your car at the gas station recently, you likely have noticed that, right? So it's a weighty actor in a couple of areas, other areas as well, which we'll see, one of which is weapons. The argument in the book is that Russia has a geographic domain, policy scope, and weight and means that are sometimes overlooked. And it has enough power beyond means alone to be disruptive, and I think we've all experienced it now, and sometimes decisive in international politics. Why is this? Well, I argue against people like, I hate to utter his name because I think he's getting way too much publicity, John Mearsheimer, and people like that. I actually had a bit of a shouting match with him on Australian radio, of all places, a few months ago. I might have called him a Putinist. I can't remember. It was ugly. Anyway, yeah, he was very like polite considering. But I argue that it is particular to Putin. This is not structural. This is not something any Russian leader would do. And if we had a different leader or a different form of government or both, then you might see Russia behaving in a very different way, despite the tools. So one of the sort of in the conclusion, the mental experiment I ask you to do in your head as a reader is think about Russia as possibly Germany after the Second World War. Think about if it had actually developed a and consolidated a democratic government, and there was investment, and the country had joined the international community definitively, and that it had a free press that was capable of criticizing the government and finding and reporting on corruption without fear of being thrown into jail. That could have been Russia's future. And it was on a path to that, at least in parts of the 1990s. And even if it didn't realize full democratization, full marketization, because the state has come back into the economy in a different way than the communist state was, but nonetheless present in the economy. Think about if it had had secure property rights, a real system of rule of law without the interference of politicians, then I think its foreign policy and how it uses those power tools would be really very different. So we can debate that if you want. So this is what I say, is that its recent aggressive behavior in international affairs, it's not just this war, is not merely structural or inevitable or reactive to what the US and NATO have done in particular. This war in Ukraine is not about NATO expansion. It's more about the example of Ukraine as a raucous civil society, imperfect democracy, but a country on Russia's border that has some cultural similarities and some linguistic similarities to Russia itself, demonstrating that it sees its future, and it's not just under Mr. Zelensky, it was under Poroshenko as well. This is what Maidan was about in 2014, sees its future in the West. Not necessarily anymore even in NATO, but in the European Union, rather than looking to Russia itself. So there's a fear of a demonstration effect for an authoritarian regime. because the regime that was overthrown in Ukraine in 2014 was one that looked a lot like Putin's in Russia, the one in Ukraine. And so there's a fear of a demonstration effect for the Russian population, but also, Russia does have interests. It might reasonably be concerned of invasion from somewhere, but NATO expansion and an invasion of Russia is not a reasonable concern. And Mr. Putin knew that. He knows it. He knew it before. He knows it now. So it's not just about national security. And this was not the only way, of course, to pursue national security interests. And so here in the book basically argues there have been lots of periods of close cooperation between the West and various leaders of the Soviet Union, of course, starting to sign arms, not just control agreements, but actual reduction agreements under Gorbachev. Yeltsin, pretty close cooperation. The book goes into much more detail, and even Putin himself, especially in the his first 2 terms, which constitutionally should have been his only 2 terms. But he's back as of 2012, and he's probably not going away until 2036 if he lives that long, and he should. Although I hear heart attacks are catching around some of the Russian elite, like the defense minister Sergei Shoigu had another one, I think, today. So Putin, Medvedev, of course, the Northern Distribution Network went through Moscow even with materials meant for us to use in Afghanistan during Medvedev's period as president. We know now Putin was very closely involved actually in a lot of those decisions, even though at this time he was acting as prime minister, not as president of Russia. He was among the first, some say the very first leader to call George W. Bush after 9/11 to express condolences, looking forward to working together with you against international terrorism. Of course, signing the New START Treaty under Medvedev. So the book is replete with these examples, right? It isn't inevitable. And we could go further back in history as well, of course, or structural. It isn't what great powers have to do. So the book also goes into the geography of Russian power, looking at its, remember that second dimension, its geographic domain beyond just the, there's a chapter that looks just at the former Soviet republics. Remember the Russian Republic that became Russia is one of 15, Ukraine being another, of course. And then where it has projected influence in other places. And I won't go into all of that for you because I know we want to stop for questions before too long. But one of the really interesting areas Russia has redeveloped old relationships, but also invested in some new ones is in the Middle East. And the book goes into some detail about this and how really without ideology in the way that the Soviets had, other than sort of illiberalism, they are able to deal effectively with countries that themselves have poor bilateral relations. So Iran and Saudi Arabia, obviously big rivals in the Middle East. Russia works with both of them on different issues. Syria, for example, and Israel. Iraq and Israel has a lot. The book goes into some details about what it is doing in Iraq as well, and selling equipment, building railroads, that sort of thing, right into Libya. Another instrument is forgiving Soviet-era loans, both in the Middle East, but into sub-Saharan Africa as well. Educating young Africans from certain countries for free at Skoltech, the school that is out in Skolkovo. Met some of them out there. And so some using soft power this way, as well as things like debt relief. So the book moves around the world, trying to demonstrate that Russia's influence has increased and diversified over time. Also selling weapons, flooding Venezuela, for example, with weapons, as well as helping to market oil that was supposed to be under sanction, even taking an ownership stake in the Venezuelan National Oil Company. Why is Nicolas Maduro still in power? Because when we were told by Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, that he was heading to the runway to get on his plane about 5 years ago, remember that? And there was going to be a change in power in Venezuela. Well, what happened? Well, 2 huge Russian planes arrived with some special forces and stopped that from happening. Why? Because they own a lot of the Venezuelan National Oil Company now, and Maduro is good for them. So that's one example of many, just demonstrating how far they've gone and where. Okay, so the one that I want to touch on, and actually that is, these two are quite relevant for Russia and China and Russia and India for the current conflict, right? So who has not condemned this war? Who is still buying things hand over fist from Russia, including weapons in both countries, sophisticated weapons, China and India. And so the Chinese, we still have, of course, oil and gas not fully sanctioned yet in the European Union. Russia's making $1 billion a day, even right now, under sanction on its oil and gas sales. Some of those are in China, which is an insatiable appetite, and some, of course, going to India. But weapons are another big thing. The Russians are second only to us in the United States in terms of purveying sophisticated weaponry around the world. And they don't care very much about to whom they are selling. Ideology does not matter. The sales of weapons or nuclear power plants, which they also sell, or oil and gas, come with no strings attached other than pay us. And now pay us in hard currency, or maybe in rubles. They keep oscillating on this at the moment. So there are no awkward demands about human rights. And we'll go in and provide, for example, if you're Democratic Republic of Congo, military protection and help you market your blood diamond. And so this is how they move around the world. One of the amazing things is how far they have come. And I showed you the GDP comparisons, globally. So their economy is now about the size of Canada's, compared to where they were at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991, where they were on, as I mentioned earlier, the verge of, extreme food scarcity. They had a barter economy because the economy was so close to complete collapse that purportedly they only had 24 hours of foreign reserves in 1997. And it was called the worst man-made catastrophe outside of wartime at the time. People literally not getting paid if they worked for state enterprises and receiving food aid. Actually, I had some of that food aid as a graduate student on the streets of Moscow. USAID chickens were being sold mysteriously out of a truck. This was obviously corrupt. I didn't completely understand what's going on, but I paid my rubles for my chicken. And a catastrophe economically. So to be back where they were before the war began here was pretty remarkable. This is just showing comparison of here's the U.S. GDP, and here just before we divide by population, not terribly impressive, about 3% of the global total. But if we divide by population, it looks better. Here is a decoupling of GDP and oil prices. So you can see it's not, here's a big drop in oil prices and GDP keeps going. This is partly an adjustment they made to the ruble. They have a good central banker. But it's also smart macroeconomic policy and changing somewhat the profile of the economy to try to get away from oil and gas alone. Shows you just debt to GDP ratio. Again, we have a high debt to our gross domestic product, and Russia has a low one. So while we're sanctioning Russian debt, unfortunately, they don't have as much as we would like to make that super effective. Okay, I'm going to pop down to this and finish off. So human development indicators show that as things got better in Russia economically, in terms of the openness of society, that got worse. And this is big ownership of the economy. They've also used hard power. These are some of the changes to the military. in terms of weapons and hybrid capabilities, and then waging friendship or soft power. And who in the room has watched RT? Anyone? Russia Today. That's, yeah, fascinating stuff. It's like the world turned upside down, isn't it? Some people don't know in the world that RT is Russia Today. If you're sitting in a hotel in Dubai, you might think, wow, these guys, there's something to it. They're critical of the US as well. It has these cultural powers of attraction and more than I'm showing here, including right down to vaccines, but also trying to get the perspective, Russian perspective on global politics out there as an alternative pole to the US and to China. Okay, so why do this? Neutrality, maybe. Why use these power resources in this way specifically in Ukraine? So we'll turn to this quickly. What does Putin want? Neutrality? Well, he could have had that already. So that's not enough. So kind of shows you it's not just about security, right? He was offered that. Could have said yes. NATO off Russian borders. NATO has not expanded to Russian borders since 2004. NATO has expanded, but has not expanded to Russian borders since 2004. Fun quiz. What was the last country to join NATO? And when? North Macedonia. It was actually North Macedonia in 2020. So North Macedonia, approximately maybe a third the size of Rhode Island, not a big fighting force. If anything, that weakens NATO, because I'm willing to bet there are very few Americans who are willing to go to war to fight North Macedonia. So if anything, that for North Macedonia, if anything, that has weakened the Article 5 commitment, not strengthened it, right? Of course, there was no imminent promise of joining, or the membership at least was not imminent of Ukraine in NATO, and the sort of unsaid understanding was you're really never going to join. Right, despite 2008, which we talked about. Then no new NATO members, wants to go back to pre-1997. So really rewriting the Cold War. And so was all this resurrection, all of this growth in pursuit of that, renegotiating the bad deal Gorbachev, Putin thinks Gorbachev got and Yeltsin got, those idiots. Well, it might be. But I'm going to, it might be that, but that's, and he told us that basically in his speeches a few weeks ago, that especially a big one at the end of February, just before the invasion, that, you know, we were taken advantage of, and now we are back and we're going to take what's rightly ours. But I think this, again, gets to the nature of this regime, which is one of the arguments in the book, is that it is not structural. It is not predetermined that any Russian leader would have reacted in this way. As Russia became more aggressive in terms of its foreign policy, internally, domestically, the regime became more oppressive and turned into a personalistic, patronal dictatorship. Now, so the big question is, has Russia's resurrection really ended with the invasion of Ukraine? And I think we can get to a discussion about miscalculations, perhaps poor intelligence on the part of Russian intelligence, and certainly our own intelligence agencies have been guilty of that. Think about Iraq, right? When Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld assured George W. Bush that our troops and tanks would be greeted with rose petals in front of them. It seems as though perhaps Putin was told the same thing, but rather than bouquets of flowers being tossed at Russian tanks by liberated Ukrainians, it was a Molotov cocktails. And I think this is partly the worldview of him and about the 5 or 6 cronies he has been holed up with in the last 2 years during COVID, who don't see Ukrainians themselves, Ukrainian people, as having individual agency and making a choice. Everyone is manipulated, everyone is controlled by one power or another. And this, I think, he did not update in terms of his thinking, and that's not Ukraine. Ukraine is a very active civil society, and it turns out that even though only 28-29% of people in February thought Zelensky was doing a great job in Ukraine, well, it turns out that doesn't mean they want to be part of Russia. And I think that's something Mr. Putin also didn't understand. it turns out NATO wasn't as fractious and torn apart as he thought it was. He's accomplished this. Sweden and Finland, they didn't want to join initially. After 1945, they're now applying for membership, and there's new unity. What has happened is probably unanticipated again, but it could also be temporary, which is that under these heavy international sanctions, which I think he was counting on not happening, that GDP may drop 10 to 15%. I've seen different. They may default on international loans for the first time since 1998. But this. So this is a survey showing that 81% of all would support the war in Russia. Now, the enthusiasm drops, or probably increases as people get older. So young Russians, not as intensely supportive, but still about 71%. I won't show it to you, but there is an experiment that was done, a survey experiment that was done by some folks at London School of Economics, where their estimate, to make a long story short, is that it's probably closer to 51% according to them. But the bottom line is the majority of Russians who have stayed in the country, and many have not, about 50 to 70,000 have left, a big brain drain as well. A lot of those are tech leaders, have so far supported the war, largely because of the information they're getting. But this may lead to ruin of the resurrection, the end of the resurrection, everything they've gained. And so perhaps if the sanctions stay on, if this war goes on much longer, we will see at some point more people take the risk of taking to the streets and demanding at least an end to the war. So because you can't get your iPhone, I don't know if I have kids in their 20s, and if they didn't have their phones or be able to upgrade their phones, they would go off the hook. Imagine that suddenly you can't travel anywhere, you can't go to school abroad, you can't have relatives come in, you can't go for your nice trip to Cyprus. All of this has happened, and how long this can go on, and I think we might see the awakening of Russian society. Okay, I'll stop there.
Kathryn, thank you very much. Have a seat.
All righty, thank you.
We're going to take. Well, you're all so much taller now.
Yeah.
It's certainly sinking these seats, Patrick. I look forward to taking everyone's question, but I get as the moderator, I get perks, and you did throw down on international relations. Not
sorry.
No. I want to be very clear. You're right about that. But that said, it's one of the reasons why I'm actually working on a book on power going forward. It's going to take forever to publish. But that said, let me ask you the most obvious question that comes to mind, given what Russia's done in Ukraine, is the following. You could have argued up until even February of this year that the thing that Putin had figured out was that there were positive returns to the effective and competent exercise of power. That what he had done in Georgia in 2008, and then Ukraine in 2014, and then Syria in 2015, all the things you listed, it wasn't just that those were gains for him. It was also that what Robert Gilpin referred to as the reputation for power got enhanced. We're 6 weeks into the war, and I guess my question is, what if that virtuous circle has become a vicious circle? Which is to say that Russia's reputation for the competent exercise of power has probably been the biggest casualty of this war. Today the Moscow was sunk in the Black Sea, and I'm sorry, my reaction to that is to laugh, and that is not a good reaction if you're Russia. You might want Americans angry or motivated or taking it seriously, but laughing at the fact that their flagship sank because of what Ukraine did. And this is hardly the only example. So I guess my question is what's happening in Ukraine in terms of Russia's reputation for the competent exercise of power reversible, or is
Putin now caught in a vicious circle where he keeps losing, he keeps trying to gamble for resurrection, and he's going to keep failing?
So, great, obviously, great question. You know that. I think it is the result of a terrible miscalculation and poor intelligence, and has had role within Russia because of that, and perhaps more will roll. But I think he was also given information with Bush, right, in Iraq that confirmed pre-existing biases for one reason or another. So in terms of the military's performance, so of course the story they're putting out is that it's not the Ukrainians who sunk Mosbacher. It was the boys working hard, and there was some ammunition exploded, and that's what sunk it. Unfortunate, embarrassing. I would just point out though what they do have a lot of new things that they can use yet, and that they could use. They have won and done well, let's say, in Syria, and eventually in Chechnya in the second part of the war, basically by pounding places into the ground. And so I unfortunately, I think that's what, but we're not done yet. That's what's coming. I think they've already demonstrated to us that pretty much complete lack of regard for international human rights and war crimes, laws against war crimes, and I think that it is hard. Reputations are easy things to lose, and my father always told me it's easy things to lose and very difficult to regain. But this is a reformed Russian army, and we certainly, had a big blunder in Vietnam, and we just had a blunder in Afghanistan, and I don't think there's that many countries in the world that people are laughing at, right? So this is the one that they're having, right? And I think it was a complete underestimation of the fact that Ukrainians actually most of them don't want to be part of Russia. And it isn't about one president or even two, that they don't want to be part of Russia and they're really going to fight. So I think we haven't seen the end yet in what Russia's willing to do. And unfortunately, we can't afford to think that they are not militarily competent when we've seen them do it in other places, especially when they don't care about leaving civilian infrastructure in place. And then, of course, nuclear weapons.
Right. I want to push you a little bit on this, and then I want to go to questions. But so your point is taken on sort of past evidence of success. The difference might be, though, was that in those instances, they were really only using Spetsnaz. They were only using their sort of cream of the crop. Whereas in Ukraine, they have tried to invade. The first plan was 4 different, axes of attack. But even what they're planning going forward is going to require relying on, contract soldiers and conscripts. And I guess my question is, can we assume that what they did, the parallels to Iraq in the United States is astonishing, because prior to Iraq, you would see the U.S. exercise power confidently in the Balkans, in the Gulf War, even in Afghanistan in 2001. Those were lightning quick forces. How is this not the same reckoning for Russia?
Well, it might be, but it isn't over yet.
Yes,
right?
no, that's
so I would say, I think that, again, I think intelligence was poor. I think it is that Putin has been and this is the weakness of autocrats, if you will, right? Has been in an echo chamber for the last 2 years, and has a view of the world, which he has articulated many times.
10,000 words.
Yes, right. He's articulated many times, and is extremely convinced of it, and of Russian power. And if you have watched him over the last 10 years in particular, as many people have, including me, how many? I don't even think this was done in the Soviet period after Stalin. How many leaders in the world show their parliament videos of new weapons, on a regular basis? He just adores his military, going out and watching test new torpedoes, that sort of thing. And so, again, I think that this has what has happened here. You know, the sent-in team initially. The Russian military is not all conscript soldiers anymore. They're mostly professional contract soldiers now. So he was clearly unaware that conscripts were going in. So Shoigu has had 2 heart attacks since then, the Minister of Defense. I mean, I'm not sure if it was Chris or Art who said if I were Russia's Minister of Defense right now, I've had a heart attack too. So he sent in some conscripts who did some very bad things, clearly. The military reforms have not faced this kind of opposition before. Absolutely poor intelligence in terms of estimating how sick Ukrainian resistance against civilians or not. And then basically, not just saying, like, we're going to focus on these 4 cities, we're going to take them right away, so we can send them a meeting. And one of my Ukrainian friends, I said, wow, they're calling on troops from Syria now and bringing in the Chechens. And she said, well, that's just because we don't want Russians to die. They're fine with Chechens dying, and but they don't want Russians to die, and they're fine with the Syrians. So they're going to use them like the British used Canadians. My relatives tell me in World War I, right? We were cannon fodder for our Australian friends. So I think that and now things have been changed and regrouped, and he's annoyed. And so unfortunately, I think it's going to be very violent, and there's no fear of raising cities anymore and bringing the full force of the Russian military, which so far they have not done. Also, the Ukrainian military has outperformed everybody's expectations, which has been wonderful.
I have a ton more questions, but that's really selfish. So, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Yeah.
Thank you. I was just wondering.
Also, if you can identify yourself.
My name is Dylan Land, and I'm a second year Wall Street here. I was wondering how the findings of your book are instructive in terms of, based on what you've discovered and learned. What do you believe is the appropriate posture towards Russia? Because I think, in the U.S. and you allow it to quote unquote resurrect, it's pretty easy to be cynical about how it will use its newfound power or reestablish power. But on the other hand, if you try and resist or push back on the resurrection of Russia, it's either 1, lead to an escalation, or 2, provide further rationale for Putin as to why exactly Russia is resurrected, or 3, both. So kind of in seeing that, what do you view as the appropriate general strategy towards Russia that U.S. leaders can kind of stage stuff?
So I think there's a bunch of different things. If you mean at this moment versus this moment going forward, and I'm going to base it on what we've done in the past. So part of the theory was, after the collapse of the Soviet Union was, democratic peace theory, which I'm sure you've been taught here or somewhere, which is democracies don't fight democracies historically, right? With a possible exception of the Falklands War. It depends on how you view Argentina at the time, but probably not at this time. Okay, Stanford. Okay, so democracies don't fight democracies. Then the policy recommendation that comes from that is let's promote democracy. So we did that in the 1990s, but we didn't do it, as full force as we might have. The Germans did really well with investment there. They invested far more than we have in terms of marketizing the economy. The theory also is like the strength of ties, right? That they're less likely to be aggressive if they're integrated into the global economic system and the global political community as well. And it was particularly important because they were such a big empire, right? And so hurt feelings. So there's an argument in the book about Weimar Russia, and some, there are some analysts, and one of them is very close to Putin, and Putin has this perspective, is that no, it was a terrible deal. You took advantage of us, right? So we took advantage of them and wanted to see a weak Russia. Well, it just logically and empirically doesn't actually make sense. Then why would we have had them in the G8? They were not one of the world's biggest economies why would we be, having exchange programs and trying to make sure we reset relations under Obama? Why would we bother to do all of those things? Why would we create programs in the State Department to bring Russian students over to the United States, or to the British did it as well, and the Canadians did it. It was to promote exchange, to sort of concretize smaller liberal democratic ideas, right? We could have invested a lot more in that. And then, we kind of turned our backs. And this is part of Angela Stanford's argument, like this in her book as well. Also won this award.
Yes.
Yeah, great friend of mine. Love Angela. But she also has this, there's some upfront to Putin. We got distracted after 9/11 in particular. I don't think it's just Putin. But, the country developed almost despite the autocracy. So he didn't bring it to this, but he takes credit for it, right? There was some smart macroeconomic policy, but that actually wasn't, those decisions weren't even necessarily by him. They were made by his very smart central banker. That was a woman, by the way. There aren't very many in Russian politics with much influence, and she is one of them, very smart woman. Wanted to quit in February. Yeah, and what's happening is the undoing of all of her good work right now, and having to fight inflation. So it isn't predetermined that Russia looks this way. So going forward, then what should our strategy be? Well, right now, as long as Putin is in office, he's a man globally, right? And he has amassed some tools, which I've shown you, right? So we have sanctioned their reserves, at least half of them, like 300 billion or so, 630 they have, and the rest are held in gold, which they can't sell. So, but they're still getting $1 billion a day from oil and gas sales, $1 billion a day. But they just moved some money into their national wealth fund to help again support the ruble. Where's that coming from? It's coming primarily from Europe, the European Union. So, they've got to get off. They've got to get off natural gas that's coming in particular from Russia. That's a hard thing to do because it's not as easy to move natural gas, but it's literally a gas. We have to ideally turn it into liquefied natural gas. It requires certain technology. It's not available easily everywhere. And oil. Oil is a little easier to change suppliers. But then Russia also has big customers in China. We have no influence, zero, in China. We have turned them into an enemy, or they have turned themselves into an enemy. And guess who's, that's in the book as well, really good friends with Vladimir Putin. They call one another best friends. And remember who went to the Olympics in February? Vladimir Putin. And basically, the very first time in 2 years, she had been coordinator in person. Giving each other medals of friendship and honor, and just declared themselves against colored revolution February 4th. So that's a problem. I think with Putin, the best we can do is continue. He's turned, what he pictured of NATO has now become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yes.
Thank you very much. When you start to but Spencer, feedback update.
Yeah, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. So, I have to disclose I'm Italian, so I do really, I really appreciate the analysis. I have a question.
Well, it's one of your very good friends.
Yeah, in the league.
Yeah.
Matteo Salvini, which is powerful.
Yeah.
So I have a question about this whole project of building this Eurasia. So what things I'd like to understand why have not been able to institutionalize the power of the nation, the power projection, right? At some point we started talking about the Eurasia project, which gravitated around Russia. But then what happened with that? What did we do with this power?
So there is a Eurasian Economic Union, the EU, and he had assumed that Ukraine would join the Eurasian Economic Union, and it is a trade bloc. It's intended to be an alternative to the European Union. And so Kazakhstan is in it. A couple of the other Central Asian states are, I think, pardon?
Belarus.
Belarus, yeah,
Oh,
Belarus, yeah. With me and me walking around right now in Russia. Lukashenko, right, Belarus. And so, Ukraine is the biggest country in Europe, if you don't count Russia as in Europe. 44 million people, big market, big producer, especially in the Donbass region, where the industrial area is, also big, agricultural region. This is what sparked Euromaidan in 2014, was that Yanukovych, then president, who had been legitimately reelected, just to show you, they go from the Orange Revolution back to that guy. And then he is supposed to sign in November of 2013 an agreement on beginning the accession process into the European Union. People come out on, he doesn't do it. People come out onto the streets to protest. That becomes Euromaidan, and he is ousted in February 20. He's not actually ousted, he runs out of the country. There's an agreement struck, and he leaves because he claims his life is in danger. Then they find his beautiful palace and gets where he lives now in Russia and Eurasia. So it was about the Eurasian Economic Union, and that is partly what this is about too. It's about the Eurasian Economic Union and turning Ukraine away from the West, not because of security so much, but again because he wants to see the world in sort of 19th century imperial terms. They are ours. They are not a separate people. Neither is Belarus. And this was even, this big sports stadium gathering of 2 or 3
rally.
The rally. Yeah. Did you know what the words to the song was? I don't know if you saw the guy coming out dancing after Putin was on stage. The song is Belarus, Ukraine, and then Vladivostok. Do you remember the words? This is all my country.
Yes,
Yeah.
Ukraine, Crimea, Belarus, and Moldova,
Right.
this is my country.
That's my answer. I know. Right. Yeah. So right. So that's what the guy was singing at the rally. So it's this is all my country. Okay. So they haven't given up on it. There's another, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SCO, is another, it's a security organization. It's supposed to be like NATO. That's also there.
All right, I apologize. We have time for, I guess, I'm going to have to take 2 questions and then go to you. So quickly.
Okay, so my name is Dan Satinsky. I graduated from Fletcher in 1990. I worked in projects and business projects in Russia until 2014, and to co-author a book on called Hammer and Silicon about Russian immigrants to the U.S. high-tech sector. So I want to follow up on your description of the sources of Russian power. And if this is a short war, then Russia is in trouble for this resurrection. But if it's a longer war, maybe, and I'm trying to sort this out for myself, Putin is betting on a disintegration of the political opposition. If Marine Le Pen gets reelected, if the Republicans take, if the U.S. consumers refuse to pay for the cost of this war and gasoline and vote against Biden, which is likely, and if all this talk about substituting LNG for Europe doesn't come true, which is also likely that it won't, because there's not free LNG in the world, and LNG terminals take 4 to 5 years to build and billions of dollars, then will European consumers be willing to be cold and pay higher prices to support Ukraine? And not to mention food riots in North Africa and in Egypt, which is what happened the last time there was a crisis in wheat. And they currently are the highest in history in those countries which depend on this. Is there a long game in which the rosy picture now of Russian defeat turns into a sort of chaotic upheaval of the global order, which may be what was intended?
Don't answer that.
If I can just interject, for those of you who want to go to the next panel of the Political Risk Conference on domestic politics. I think that started in ASEAN Auditorium right now, but we may go over time. But
All right, last question.
My name is Walter Streeter. I'm a current small student, and I was wondering, in 2017, there was a spike in Chinese tourism to Russia to celebrate the 100th year of the Soviet Revolution. And since the war in Ukraine has started, South Africa has notably voted, has not voted for sanctions. And a foreign policy article says that part of that was misplaced nostalgia for the Soviet era. So I wanted you to talk about Russian soft power and what role does Soviet nostalgia play in that, if at all?
Okay, I'll do it very fast. Okay, so I can probably take that quickly. Well, I'll take your question quickly. Right. So this, but there are a lot of contingencies in the scenario you just presented, right? So in fact, Americans do have to not just give the Republicans a majority in Congress in the midterms, but would also have to vote out Biden, who would have to survive until that time comes. The war
Also,
would,
you'd have to have a Republican that actually was willing to sound like Trump.
right,
Because a lot of the Republicans, I mean, admittedly, there's some that sound like a lot.
right. But Le Pen could win. She probably won't, though. There is a paper by a very good Russian economist, Sergei Guriev, who actually was a Foucault. He left the country a number of years ago. Used to be chief economist with EBRD, who says actually, there's a way that Europeans can get off it with LNG. They can bring in floating terminals. They can, so and it wouldn't be that dislocating to the economy. So I can refer you to the paper. But right, I mean, so this is very dangerous. It's a very dangerous moment geopolitically. And yes, seeds have been planted in other countries that are more pro-Russian than we would imagine here, right? I don't think this is such a bad thing. On soft power, sorry, the question was.
Soft power, and particularly Soviet nostalgia. as a
Oh, right.
component of soft power.
Right. So abroad, there are some places where they've used, and that this is in the book, especially I'm thinking of, like, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, where they've used the legacy relationships of the Soviet period, where either the presidents of some sub-Saharan African countries were educated in Russia or the Soviet Union, and now either their kids are in power or high up, and so they've used some of those legacy relationships, to be sure. In terms of other points of nostalgia, there are some within Russia, but there and there are certainly some even within other republics of the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, but not much globally, I would say, other than that. And Cuba.
Okay, our time has come to an end, which is a shame because I want to ask you like 7 more questions. But please
And
join
I'd
me.
love to answer.
Yes, please join me in giving Kathryn Stoner a round of applause. The book is available for purchase online.
yes, we have books for sale outside, and I'm sure Professor Stoner will be happy to sign them. And we also have some coffee, tea, and refreshments. So please Yes, I nothing. Well, yes, we were talking about
So, no, I definitely, no, not much.